Whatever you think you've found, I need you to think carefully. Think about what I've built. The voice was steady, warm even. The kind of warmth that wraps around your throat. Before you realize it's tightening. It has your name on it, all of it, every company, every contract, every signature. A pause, long enough to hear breathing on the other end of the line, long enough to hear doubt settle into the silence. Like sediment finding the bottom of a glass. You push this, Cass, and the folder doesn't just NB. One more beat. One more breath. It ends us both. That voice belonged to the man Caspian Shaw trusted most, his managing partner of 12 years, the man who sat across from him in boardrooms and at bar tables, who shook his hand at closings and poured his scotch at celebrations. Every word of trust, every reassurance, every contract signed on the strength of that handshake, all of it was a lie. But before we get to that phone call, and the weapons Sterling Graves built with Caspian's own name, we need to go back. Back to a Tuesday morning, a drafting table, and the one sentence that cracked Sterling's entire operation wide open. But first, welcome, welcome to the hearth. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. And if you've been here since part 1, welcome back. You already know what this story does to you. Now, this is part 3. So if you haven't heard parts 1 and 2 yet, don't worry. I've got you covered. Scroll down right now and look for the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Both links are right there. Part 1 and part 2. Ready and waiting for you. Go ahead and check. I'll wait. And while you're down there, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Last time I saw people checking in from Texas, from London, someone out in the Bahamas. I see every single one of those, and they make my night. So let me know where you are. If you haven't subscribed yet, tonight's the night. After what you're about to hear, you are not going to want to miss what comes next in part 4. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with me. Now, let's go back to that Tuesday morning. Lyra was at her drafting table. The phone rang, and the man on the other end had no idea he was about to destroy himself. Sterling had visited Lyra's firm and warned her about Caspian, called him obsessive and dangerous, and Caspian, somewhere across the city, was circling the same truth from a different angle, never knowing what Lyra had uncovered. The only man standing between them was about to make the one mistake that would cost him everything. Tuesday morning, 9:14. Lyra sat at her drafting table with a mechanical pencil in her right hand, working through an elevation redesign on a residential project. Clean lines, sharp angles, the kind of focused quiet that made her mind feel organized. Her phone buzzed against the wood surface, rattling faintly beside a row of pencils arranged in descending order of hardness. The name on the screen was Sterling Graves. She answered. He opened warm, paternal, that same careful tone from her office 2 days earlier. Measured kindness, deliberate concern, a voice shaped to make you feel looked after, while it steered you exactly where it wanted you to go. He referenced their previous conversation, said he hoped he hadn't been too forward showing up at her firm unannounced. You weren't, she said. 2 words. But the delivery, flat, unhurried, offering nothing beyond acknowledgement, told everything. She was measuring him now, weighing each syllable against a set of calculations she hadn't shared with anyone. Something in her had shifted between that visit and this call, and she was listening, not for what he said, but for what the structure of his words revealed. Alert not to the sounds a building makes, but to the ones it shouldn't. Sterling pressed on. He reframed Caspian's reservation as fixation rather than devotion, painted it as the behavior of a man who couldn't release what was gone, who had turned a corner table into a monument because he lacked the capacity to move forward. He said it with sympathy, gentle, measured, spoken the way you describe someone unwell, and that sympathy was the most damning part, because it sounded so reasonable. Then he said it. The photographs, the locket, the way it sits right under that old receipt with CS facing up. It's not healthy, Lyra. Her pencil stopped. Not her hand. her pencil, as if the graphite itself refused to continue against the paper. The line she'd been drawing, a clean roofline, precise and unbothered, ended in a hard dot where pressure met sudden stillness. She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She processed. Her mind didn't react in emotions first. It worked in structures, load paths, stress points, systems under tension. And right now, Sterling's sentence was a beam that didn't connect to any wall she had built. She had never told Sterling about the locket's initials. Caspian Shaw's initials, engraved on the casing, never mentioned which direction they faced. She had never described the locket's placement beneath the old receipt. That specific layering, that exact arrangement inside the box. Sterling didn't just know the locket existed. He knew the orientation of two tiny letters stamped into metal, facing up. That wasn't the knowledge of a man who had heard a passing description. That was the knowledge of a man who had stood over that box, lifted the receipt aside, and inspected what lay beneath it. Only Silas knew those details, because Silas had found the box himself, opened it with the careful hands of a boy who understood that certain things are precious before you understand why. No one outside her apartment had seen what sat inside that box, how its contents were arranged, or which way the engraving caught the light. The only way Sterling could know was one of two possibilities. Either he had been inside her home and lifted the lid himself, somewhere beyond the living room where his visit never reached, or someone had been cataloguing the details of her private life with a precision that went far beyond casual interest. And then there was a third possibility, quieter than the other two, and infinitely colder. The only other time that locket had existed outside her apartment was nearly a decade ago, sealed inside a clear plastic hospital bag, catalogued alongside the personal effects of a woman who couldn't remember her own name. A man who held it then would know exactly how the initials sat. He would know because he turned it over in his fingers, read the engraving, and placed it back. 3 seconds of silence sat between them on the open line. Sterling felt it. "Lyra, you still there?" His voice carried something new. Not panic, not yet, but a shift beneath the polish, the faintest vibration of a man who has felt the floor tilt beneath him, but hasn't thought to look down at the crack forming under his feet. "I'm here," she said, neutral, flat. The voice of a woman trained to identify structural failure before the building knows it's falling. She hung up, set the phone face down on the drafting table, sat perfectly still. 2 mistakes. Same foundation, same man. He didn't just mention the locket. He described its orientation. That single detail separated hearsay from handling. It was the difference between a man who had been told about an object and a man who had held one. Sterling's lies had architecture. She could see that now, the skeleton visible once she understood the logic. Load-bearing walls dressed as open space, designed to look like nothing while holding everything in place. Every warm phone call, every concerned visit, every gentle warning about Caspian, all of it structural, all of it deliberate, all of it holding up a version of reality that required her ignorance to remain standing. And now, for the first time, she could see the blueprint. She picked up the phone. This time, she didn't call Sterling. She called the hospital, the one where she spent 11 days all those years ago, unconscious and unnamed, waking into a world scrubbed clean of everyone she'd ever loved. She requested her complete medical file. Every page, every form, every signature attached to her care during those 11 days she'd lost. The woman on the other end asked for the date of admission. Lyra opened her mouth, and, the first time that morning, for the first time since the pencil stopped and her mind began dismantling Sterling's architecture with surgical precision, her voice trembled, just once, just enough to feel the vibration in her own throat, a fracture in the composure she'd held since the call ended. She gave the date, the one date she had never forgotten, because it was the date her life restarted without her consent. She said it clearly, pressing through the crack in her voice, not pretending the resistance wasn't there, but refusing to let it stop the mark from landing. The woman confirmed the request. 5 to 7 business days. Lyra thanked her, hung up, and set the phone down beside her pencils. Her hands were still, her breathing was even, but something behind her ribs, something deeper than logic, older than any structure she'd ever studied, already knew what that file would contain, and it terrified her, not because she was afraid of what she'd find, but because she was certain she'd recognize it. If you caught what Sterling just accidentally revealed, drop one word in the comments, the locket, because that single sentence changed everything. He didn't just mention what was inside that box. He described which way the initials faced, and you only know that if you've held it in your hands. He knew details that only someone standing over her all those years ago, in a hospital room beside a woman who couldn't fight back, would know. And now, Lyra knows it too. The file she just requested is already on its way, and what's waiting inside it is going to turn Sterling's careful, quiet construction into rubble. The following Thursday, a courier knocked twice on Lyra's apartment door and handed her a manila envelope thick enough to hold a small history. 9 days had passed since Sterling's phone call. 9 days since the pencil stopped and the blueprint revealed itself. The hospital had processed her request faster than promised. 5 to 7 business days, the woman had said, and it arrived on the 6th. Lyra signed the courier's tablet, closed the door, and carried the envelope to her drafting table. Without opening it on the walk across the room, she held it flat against her side, feeling its weight against her ribs, letting herself understand what she was about to do before she did it. The drafting table still held the residential elevation she'd been working on when Sterling called. The roofline that ended in a hard dot, the line she hadn't finished and hadn't erased. She swept everything aside. Elevation drawings, specification sheets, trace paper, the row of mechanical pencils in their descending order of hardness, all of it pushed to the edges of the table with both hands, cleared the way you clear a surface before laying out something that demands your full attention. The drafting table became an examination surface, a place where you spread the bones of a thing and read them for what they are. She opened the envelope with a letter opener, precise, controlled, slid the contents free and laid them flat against the wood. The file was thick, over 60 pages of medical records, administrative forms, treatment notes, and discharge documentation. Spanning 11 days of a life she couldn't remember living, she began to read, line by line, page by page, from the front of the file to the back, from the ground up, checking every connection, every joint, every point where one system handed its load to the next. The first pages were admission records. Date, nearly a decade ago, almost to the week. Time of arrival, 2:47 a.m. Condition on intake, unconscious, unresponsive, no identification on her person. The language was clinical, detached, stripped of anything resembling human warmth. The institutional voice of a system designed to process bodies, not people. Vitals recorded in columns, observations noted in shorthand. The facts of a woman arriving at a hospital, the way inventory arrives at a warehouse. Logged, catalogued, stored. Nothing in those first pages acknowledged that the body on the gurney had a name, a career, a man who would have torn the city apart to find her, a love strong enough to produce a child. The hospital didn't know those things. The hospital knew blood pressure and heart rate and the dimensions of a skull fracture measured in centimeters. Everything else had been erased before the admitting nurse finished her shift. The second layer was treatment notes, neurological assessment conducted within the first 12 hours. The handwriting changed here, smaller, tighter. The careful script of a specialist accustomed to writing things that would be read in legal proceedings and insurance reviews. The word retrograde appeared once in the first paragraph, then again in the second, and twice more in the summary at the bottom of the page. 4 times. The same clinical term, repeated with the quiet insistence of a diagnosis that refused to soften itself. Retrograde amnesia, the medical term for a life interrupted at the root. Not the loss of a single memory or a forgotten afternoon, but the wholesale removal of everything that came before the moment of injury. The doctors had written it without emotion, They were describing a condition. But what they were really documenting in their careful clinical shorthand was the shape of the cage Lyra had been living inside for nearly a decade. The walls were made of absence, the lock was made of silence, and someone had built it around her while she lay in that bed, unable to object. She turned another page, and another. Medication logs, physical therapy evaluations, discharge planning notes written in 3 different hands, none of them hers. And then, near the back of the file, tucked behind a radiology report and a dietary consultation form, she found it. A single sheet, yellowed slightly at the edges. The paper stock older and heavier than the forms surrounding it. The heading read, Emergency Contact and Decision-Making Authority. Lyra's eyes moved to the signature line at the bottom of the page. She went straight to the handwriting. Because the signature tells you who stood behind the document, who claimed it, who said, "This is mine," with the stroke of a pen. The handwriting was not rushed. It was not uncertain. Each letter sat on the line with the confidence of someone who had thought about this moment before it arrived, or who had rehearsed it privately until it felt like something natural. The strokes were unhurried, deliberate, the penmanship of a man who understood that this piece of paper would outlast the moment it was signed in, that it would sit in a file for years, that someone might one day hold it up to the light and read it for what it really was. Sterling Graves, his name, his handwriting. His signature on a form that gave him authority over every medical decision made for a woman who could not speak for herself. And beside the signature, in the designated field for relationship to patient, 2 words written in that same steady hand, family friend. He was at the hospital before Caspian knew Lyra was hurt, before anyone could have reached him, before the news could have traveled through any channel that moved at the speed of genuine concern. Sterling was already there, already standing at the admissions desk, already picking up a pen. He signed paperwork claiming that Lyra had no family, no partner, no one waiting for her, searching for her, sitting beside a phone that refused to ring. He wrote, family friend, in the space where Caspian's name should have been. And in doing so, he erased the man she loved from her records. Quickly, cleanly, leaving nothing but the faint impression of something that used to be there. This is what Sterling Graves did in that hospital room. He stood beside an unconscious woman, a woman who had a man who loved her, a life full of warmth and connection, a love that would endure years of silence and an empty chair, and he decided those people didn't exist. He didn't forge documents, he didn't hack a system or bribe an official. He walked in, picked up a pen provided by the hospital itself, and committed the quietest, cruelest act of theft a person can commit against another human being. When the nurses asked, "Is anyone here for her?" Sterling replaced the truth with silence. He stole the answer to the only question that mattered. Does anyone love this woman? And he buried it so deep that nearly a decade would pass before it found its way back to the surface. 2 cracks, same wall. The line ran straight and clean from Sterling's voice on the phone. The photographs, the locket, the way it sits right under that old receipt with the initials facing up. To a hospital room in the past. The man who knew the orientation of initials on a locket he should never have touched was the same man who signed his name beside the bed of a woman he had no right to reach. The construction he had built. Years of careful, quiet lies stacked one on top of another, each depending on the one below it, each requiring the ones above to remain in place, was showing its fractures. And once you see the fracture pattern, once you understand where the failure lives, the rest is a matter of time and pressure. Lyra closed the file. She pressed both palms flat against the cool surface of the drafting table, fingers spread wide, skin slightly damp against the wood. She held that position, feet planted, weight distributed, every sense tuned to the structure around her, reading the room the way she read failing buildings, not with panic, but with precision. This was not a woman falling apart. This was a woman who had located the load-bearing failure in a structure she'd been living inside for years, a structure she hadn't built, hadn't chosen, hadn't even known existed until a phone call and a locket and an envelope full of yellowed paper showed her the blueprint. And now she was deciding, not reacting, deciding how to bring down a compromised building, not with rage, not with haste, but with the absolute certainty that what cannot stand must not be allowed to pretend it can. She stood, slid the file into her bag alongside the photograph, the one Aldo had kept for all those years, the one Caspian had brought to her apartment, the one that had triggered 3 seconds of memory so vivid she could still feel the weight of the locket against her throat when she closed her eyes. 2 pieces of evidence now, the photograph that proved they were real, the signature that proved someone had tried to make them disappear. She pressed the clasp shut and pulled her coat from the hook by the door. She didn't call ahead. She didn't text. She drove to Vesper. Vesper in the late afternoon was a different creature than Vesper on a Friday night. The dinner crowd brought noise and warmth and the overlapping hum of conversation, glasses touching, chairs shifting on hardwood. But at this hour, 4:30 on a Thursday, the kitchen still dark, the evening staff not yet arrived, the restaurant existed in a state of suspension. Most of the chairs were still inverted on their tables, legs pointing upward like a small forest of bare trees. The scent of lemon polish hung in the still air, alongside cedar and old leather, and the ghost of espresso grounds from the morning's last pot. Still clinging to surfaces that had absorbed decades of coffee and conversation, and the particular kind of quiet that accumulates in rooms where important things have been said and left to settle. The front windows let in a low, late-afternoon light that crossed the hardwood floor in wide golden bands, catching dust motes suspended in the stillness, visible only when the light fell at exactly that angle. The way certain truths are visible only when you finally stand in the right place to see them. Aldo was behind the bar. He saw her the moment she appeared in the doorway. Bag over one shoulder, coat still on, standing in the frame of the entrance with the posture of a woman who had arrived somewhere she didn't plan to go but couldn't stay away from. He said nothing, didn't greet her, didn't ask if she needed anything, didn't reach for a menu or a glass. He simply stepped to one side, recognizing that the person in front of him was carrying something heavier than conversation could hold. He let her pass. She walked through the empty dining room toward the corner table, the table that had held 2 chairs for nearly a decade, Caspian's, and the empty one beside it, the one that waited without being asked, holding space for a woman who didn't know she was being remembered every Friday night by a man who refused to let her disappear. Now the table held 3 chairs. The geometry had changed the week before, when Silas climbed into the seat that seemed built for exactly his body, and the number shifted from 2 to 3, and the emptiness that had defined that corner was quietly, permanently replaced by something full. Lyra didn't sit in Caspian's chair. She didn't sit in the one Silas had claimed. She sat in the third, the chair she had chosen the previous week without understanding why, the one her body had moved toward before her mind could form a reason. Gravity, or something older than gravity, the kind of pull that lives in the body when the mind has been stripped clean. Muscle and bone carrying the imprint of a life, the way old wood carries the impression of hands that have rested against it for years. She settled into the chair and rested her fingers against her throat. This was not the unconscious flutter she'd felt in weeks past. The instinctive, half-aware brush of fingertips searching for something she couldn't name. This was deliberate. She pressed the pads of 2 fingers against the hollow at the base of her neck, the exact spot where a chain once rested against her pulse. The phantom weight of the locket was sharper now. Sterling's knowledge had made it sharper, not because the locket itself had changed, but because his ability to describe its initials, its orientation, its placement inside a box he was never invited to open, had confirmed something she'd only suspected before. Someone had taken the locket off her neck. Someone had held it, turned it, read the engraving. Someone who was never supposed to have been in that hospital room, standing over her unconscious body, handling the objects that rested against her skin. The phantom weight wasn't just absence anymore. It was evidence. The tablecloth stretched across the surface in front of her, smooth and clean, the fabric catching the low afternoon light and holding it softly. Dark wood framed the cloth on all sides. The warm glow from the front windows fell at its lowest angle now, pressing through old glass and laying itself across the floor, and the tabletop, and the empty chairs and the cedar panels on the far wall. Dust moved through the light without hurrying. The room held still, the particular stillness of a space that knows something important is about to happen inside it. For nearly a decade, 3 words had protected her. 3 words she had spoken more times than she could count, to more people than she could remember, which was its own kind of cruelty, that she could forget the people she'd said them to as easily as she'd forgotten the life they were asking about. I don't remember. She'd said it to doctors in the weeks after she woke. Calm, clinical professionals who asked careful questions and wrote her answers in files she would one day request from a courier. She'd said it to colleagues who noticed the gap in her history, the way her biography seemed to begin abruptly, a book missing its first 3 chapters. She'd said it to herself on mornings when something, a scent, a sound, the particular quality of light through a window, triggered a sensation she couldn't attach to any event, any place, any person. Those words had been armor, necessary, real, a way of naming the void without falling into it, of acknowledging the loss without letting the loss define every waking moment. She had worn those words the way she wore her professionalism and her precision and her steady structural eye, as protection, as framework, as a way of building a self that could stand on its own, even when the foundation was missing. And they were finished. She felt it the way she felt the failure point in a compromised beam, not as emotion first, but as fact. The armor had served its purpose. It had kept her upright through years of not knowing, through the quiet daily violence of living inside a gap she couldn't explain. But the gap wasn't what she'd believed it was. It wasn't empty. It wasn't the natural consequence of an injury that stole her past the way a storm takes a roof. The gap was constructed, built by a man with steady handwriting and a signature on a hospital form and knowledge of a locket he should never have touched. The gap was not a wound. It was a room, and someone had locked her inside it. I want to know. She said it aloud, to the empty restaurant, to the corner table with its 3 chairs and its clean cloth and its warm late afternoon light, to the woman she had been before someone decided she wasn't allowed to exist. The words landed in the quiet room and stayed there, resting against the cedar and the leather and the old glass. Sound held by a space built to hold it. Not for Caspian, not for Silas, for herself. For the woman who had walked through years of her own life on ground she now knew was stolen. Not missing, not misplaced, not lost to the cruel indifference of a brain injury that took what it took and left what it left. Stolen, taken deliberately by a man who stood in a hospital room and decided that her connections to the people who loved her were inconvenient, that her history was an obstacle, that her existence as a whole person, remembered, claimed, loved, was a threat to something he valued more than her life. The gap in her memory wasn't empty. It was a crime scene, and she was done pretending otherwise. This is the moment, friends. The moment Lyra stops running from her past and starts hunting for the truth. She's not doing it for anyone else. She's doing it for herself, and that's what makes her dangerous. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Let me see those likes climbing. And if you haven't shared this series with someone who loves a good story, now's the time. Send them the link. Bring them to the hearth. While Lyra was uncovering the signature that erased her past, Caspian was following the money that would expose their future. Caspian's office occupied the 42nd floor of a building made almost entirely of glass and steel, the kind of structure that announces wealth not through ornamentation, but through the audacity of transparency, as if the man who worked inside it had nothing to hide. On clear mornings, the river view bent west toward the harbor, and the water caught the early light and turned it into something that looked like hammered tin, flat, bright, industrial in its beauty. This was not a clear morning. The sky hung low and grey, pressing against the windows, and the river below looked like wet concrete, colorless and heavy. moving without enthusiasm toward a harbor obscured by weather that couldn't decide whether to commit to rain or simply threaten it. His desk sat near the windows, a slab of tempered glass mounted on brushed steel supports that cost more than most people's annual salary. It held a laptop, a phone, a leather folio, and a brass pen stand that had been a gift from Sterling on the 5th anniversary of their partnership. Caspian had never moved it, never thought about moving it. It had sat in the same position for years, undisturbed, unexamined, accepted as a permanent fixture in a life that had stopped changing the day Lyra vanished. The desk felt exactly as useful as a prop in a play he no longer wanted to perform. He had spent the last several days doing what he should have done long ago, the thing grief had made impossible and trust had made unnecessary. He was looking at the machinery of his own empire, and he was seeing it clearly for the first time since he'd stopped looking at anything clearly. Since the only number that mattered became the count of empty chairs at a corner table, and every other metric, every contract, every quarterly report, every wire transfer that crossed his desk with Sterling's summary attached, became noise he signed without reading. The problem was structural. Sterling had managed his affairs for over a decade, not just the partnership, the full architecture of Caspian's financial life. Every investigator the firm retained ran through Sterling's office before reaching Caspian's desk. Every auditor filed reports that Sterling reviewed first. Every channel of inquiry, every compliance check, every red flag that might have surfaced in the normal course of doing business at this level. All of it passed through one man's hands before it reached another's. The system wasn't broken. The system was compromised, designed that way carefully and patiently by the man who controlled the flow of information like a dam controls the flow of water. Not by stopping it, but by deciding where it goes. So Caspian went outside the system. He found a forensic investigator with no ties to the firm, no history with Sterling, no professional relationship with anyone in Caspian's circle. She came recommended through a former colleague from a different industry entirely, someone who had left the financial world years ago and had no reason to mention the referral to anyone who mattered. The investigator worked from a rented office above a bakery in the financial district, a fourth-floor walk-up where the hallway smelled like proofing dough and cardamom, and the filing cabinets were older than most of the analysts working downtown. She was methodical, discreet, and entirely unimpressed by the size of the numbers involved. Caspian gave her one instruction: follow the money. Every transaction Sterling touched, start at the beginning, don't skip anything. The folder arrived on Thursday afternoon. That same Thursday, the same day Lyra sat at her drafting table 12 miles south and pressed her palms flat against the wood after reading a signature that changed everything she thought she knew about her own history. The same day, the same weight, arriving at 2 different tables, carried by 2 people who had no idea the other was bearing it. The folder was plain manila, no label, no cover letter, no summary page. Just the raw findings, organized chronologically, printed on standard weight paper. Caspian opened it at his desk. Read the first page, and read it again. Then he set the folder down and placed both hands flat on the glass surface of his desk. Palms spread wide, fingers pressing into the cool transparency. The weight of his upper body transferring downward into the glass, seeking the point of resistance that would tell him whether the surface beneath him could hold what he was carrying. He held that position for several seconds, staring at the folder without seeing it, feeling the chill of the glass seep into his skin. 2 people, 2 tables. Same gesture, same weight, and neither one knows the other is carrying it. The first irregular transaction in the folder was dated 14 months before the accident. 14 months. Not at the time of the accident, not in the chaotic aftermath, when a man like Sterling might have seized an opportunity that presented itself through chance. 14 months before Lyra was hurt, before she lost her memory, before she vanished from Caspian's life and left behind an empty chair and a reservation that would run for the better part of a decade. Sterling was already moving money, already constructing a financial architecture that required, above all else, one specific condition to survive: Caspian's inattention. And 14 months before the accident, Caspian was none of the things that would have made that inattention possible. He was not distracted. He was not disengaged. He was not the hollow, grief-numbed executive who would later sign documents without reading them and trust his partner's word because trust was all he had left, and questioning it felt like losing one more thing. 14 months before the accident, Caspian Shaw was in love. And Caspian in love was Caspian at his most dangerous. Not to Lyra, not to anyone who deserved his attention, but to anyone who needed him not to notice. A man in love is a man awake, present, sharp, engaged with the texture of his own life in a way that makes him catch details he might otherwise overlook. The inflection in a partner's voice when the numbers don't add up, the slight hesitation before a signature is requested, the contract clause that reads differently the third time through than it did the first. Caspian in love was Caspian reading every line, asking questions, following up, checking the math, not because he distrusted Sterling, but because he was alive to everything around him, because the woman he loved had made the world worth paying attention to, and that attention bled into his work, his contracts, his partnerships, his money. So Sterling removed the thing that made Caspian pay attention, not the accident itself. The investigator's report couldn't prove that, and Caspian sat with the ambiguity, aware of it, suspicious of it, unwilling to declare it failed until the evidence was conclusive. The accident might have been chance. It might have been exactly what it appeared to be, a random, terrible event that shattered a life and scattered its pieces across a hospital floor. But everything that came after was choice. Every single thing Sterling did in the hours, days, and years following that accident was deliberate. He went to the hospital before anyone else knew. He signed the forms. He erased Caspian from the records. He buried Lyra. Not in the ground, but in silence, in absence, in the carefully maintained fiction that she had no one, that she belonged to no one, that the man who loved her did not exist. And burying Lyra buried Caspian. It turned him into exactly the man Sterling needed, the grief-hollowed executive who signed whatever was placed before him, who stopped reading fine print, who kept a reservation like a man tending a grave, who ran his thumb along the rim of a glass every Friday night and watched a door that never opened. Caspian's grief was not a side effect. It was the mechanism, his devotion, the very devotion that kept that table set and waiting for all those years, was the instrument of his own robbery. Every Friday night Caspian sat alone in that restaurant holding faith the man who had taken her was watching. And the longer Caspian grieved, the quieter he became. The quieter he became, the fewer questions he asked. The fewer questions he asked, the more money Sterling moved. Premeditated, calculated, deeply, viciously personal, Caspian sat with that knowledge, the specific, nauseating recognition that his grief was someone else's business plan, that the worst thing that had ever happened to him was not random cruelty or cosmic indifference, but a business decision made by a man who needed him broken because broken men don't read contracts. Every Friday night at that corner table, every untouched glass of whiskey, every time he stared at the empty chair and felt the absence pressing against his chest. All of it catalogued, filed, used. His grief wasn't just his anymore. It had never been just his. It was an asset on someone else's ledger. His heartbreak was a line item in someone else's profit margin. And the man who profited from it had the audacity to call him partner, to pour his scotch, to pat his shoulder on difficult anniversaries and say, "She'd want you to keep going, Cass," knowing with every syllable that the reason Caspian couldn't keep going was sitting in a filing cabinet with Sterling's signature on it. He turned to the next section of the report. Shell companies. 6 of them, registered across 3 jurisdictions, each one bearing the same name on its incorporation documents. Caspian Shaw, not Sterling Graves, not a borrowed identity or a fabricated alias. Caspian's real name, attached to real entities, filed with real regulatory bodies, backed by contracts bearing Caspian's authentic signatures, signatures given freely during years of grief-soaked autopilot. Every, "Trust me on this, Kaz." Every, Just a formality. I'll walk you through it later. Every document slid across a glass desk toward a man who had stopped reading fine print, because the only print that mattered was the handwriting in a reservation book that read, Shaw, 2, corner table, Friday, indefinite. Sterling had built the cage with Caspian's own hands, fed him the pen, guided the paper, and let grief do the rest. But there was something worse, and Caspian almost missed it because the nausea from the first revelation was still sitting in his chest like a stone. Sterling had used Caspian's name, Caspian's money, and Caspian's captured signatures to purchase and develop commercial properties across the same corridors where Lyra had rebuilt her career, the same neighborhoods, the same commercial districts, architecture firms she competed against for contracts. Some of them operated from buildings owned on paper by shell companies bearing Caspian's name, the projects she bid on, the developments she redesigned, the structures she walked through with her precise eye and her steady hands, reading their bones for what they were. Those buildings stood on ground that Sterling's stolen money had purchased and Caspian's captive signature had claimed. He didn't just erase Lyra from Caspian's world. He inserted himself, invisibly, financially, structurally, into hers. He controlled the landscape she walked through without her ever knowing that the ground beneath her feet belonged to the man who had put her in a hospital bed and the man who had grieved her from a corner table. Sterling had built the crime around both of them, wrapped it around their lives like a wall they couldn't see because they were standing inside it. If anyone exposed the shell companies, the stolen funds, the captured signatures, the structure would collapse on Caspian first. His name on every document, his signatures authentic and freely given, his money moved through his companies, funding developments in her industry, and the debris from Caspian's collapse would land directly on Lyra, the woman who had built her second career on ground that was poisoned from the foundations up, a perfect architecture of blame, constructed with the pen of its own victim. Caspian closed the folder. He looked at the river through 42 stories of glass, the grey water moving without urgency toward a harbour he couldn't see, the city sprawling beneath him in every direction. The man he'd called partner for over a decade had stolen his money, stolen his love, stolen years of his son's life, a son whose existence he hadn't known about until a boy walked into a restaurant and sat in a chair that had been empty since before he was born. And Sterling had done all of it with Caspian's own hand. Sterling built this trap so that exposing him destroys Caspian. Exposing Caspian destroys Lyra. And the whole thing was signed with real signatures, not forged, not fabricated, not manufactured in a back room. Real ink on real paper, given willingly by a man who trusted the hand that guided the pen. So here's my question. Do you think there's a way out? Drop your theory in the comments. I want to hear what you think. But the money wasn't Sterling's only surveillance tool. He had eyes inside the one place Caspian believed was sacred. Vesper after hours held a different kind of silence than Vesper in the late afternoon. The afternoon quiet was expectant, a room holding its breath between services, waiting to be filled again. But this silence, the one that settled over the restaurant after the last plate was cleared and the last guest departed and the kitchen went dark, was the silence of a room that had done its work and was resting, old wood cooling, leather settling, the particular stillness that accumulates in spaces where important things have been said and left to sink into the walls. A single brass fixture hung above the bar, casting a warm circle of light across the polished mahogany surface. Not enough to illuminate the room, just enough to hold back the dark in one small place. The rest of the restaurant sat in shadow, chairs inverted on tables, the front windows reflecting nothing but the faint glow of street lamps pressing against old glass. The kitchen was dark. The dining room was dark. Only the bar held light, and in that light stood Aldo. He held a glass in his weathered hands, the same glass he'd polished every Friday for years, or one identical to it. The same slow rotation, clockwise, the cloth moving against the crystal, with the same careful pressure he'd applied 1,000 times before. It was the motion that steadied him, the thing his hands did when his mind was carrying something too heavy for stillness. For years, That rotation had been enough. The rhythm of cloth against crystal, the small, predictable circle of a task that never changed, had kept him anchored through all those Friday nights of watching and saying nothing, watching Caspian arrive, watching him sit at the corner table, watching him stare at an empty chair and run his thumb along the rim of a whiskey glass, and leave 2 hours later looking exactly as hollow as when he'd arrived. But tonight, something was different. Aldo set the glass down. The motion stopped. The cloth went still. He placed the glass on the bar with a soft sound, crystal meeting mahogany, and set the cloth beside it in a neat fold. His hands came to rest on the bar top, palms flat, fingers spread against the polished wood, still and certain. The hands of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to arrive where the decision becomes speech. Caspian sat at the bar across from him, not at the corner table tonight. This was not a Friday ritual, not a vigil, not the weekly act of devotion that had defined his relationship with this restaurant. He had come because Aldo had called him. 2 words spoken in the old man's careful voice. Come tonight. Caspian had come. He sat on a bar stool with his hands resting on the mahogany and his coat still on, as if he understood instinctively that this would not be a long visit. That what Aldo had to say would be said quickly, not because it was small, but because it had been held for so long that releasing it would take very little time. A door locked for years swings open fast once the bolt is finally drawn. Mr. Shaw. Aldo's voice was steady, but the steadiness was earned. The kind that comes not from calm, but from having rehearsed the words until the emotion behind them no longer shook the delivery. There is something I should have told you long ago. Caspian waited. He had learned more from silence in the past 2 weeks than from all the conversations of the past several years. Silence was where the truth lived. In the spaces between polished sentences, in the pauses people filled with coughs and subject changes and careful redirections. Aldo's hands pressed harder against the bar top. The wood held. The restaurant manager. He takes calls. From Mr. Graves. A pause. Not for effect, but for the weight of what came next. He has for years. Every visit you make, when you arrive, how long you stay, whether anyone sits with you, he reports everything. The words landed in the warm circle of light and stayed there, resting on the polished mahogany between 2 men who had spent years occupying the same room without ever having this conversation. Caspian did not move. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation, quiet and devastating, of every Friday night he had spent in this restaurant, believing he was alone with his grief. The corner table, the cloth, replaced fresh every Friday morning, whether anyone was coming or not. The empty chair across from him pulled out slightly as if someone had just stood up and might return at any moment. The candle Aldo lit without being asked. The whiskey poured without being ordered. The 2 hours of silence that Caspian believed were his. Private, sacred, the one space in his life where his devotion to a missing woman was not performed for anyone but himself. All of it watched. All of it reported. Every lonely Friday, catalogued and transmitted to the man who had caused the loneliness in the first place. Every untouched glass of whiskey, noted. Every time Caspian stared at the door that never opened, filed. Every evening he sat for 2 hours and left without speaking to anyone, confirmed and relayed to a man who needed to know the distraction was holding, that the grief was still doing its work, that the broken man was still broken enough to keep signing documents without reading them. The sacred place. The restaurant Caspian had purchased not as an investment, but as an act of preservation, buying the building so the table could never be moved, so the reservation could never be cancelled, so the physical space where he had last been happy could remain exactly as it was for as long as he needed it to. That restaurant, his monument, his vigil, his quiet cathedral of devotion, had been Sterling's observation post. The place where Caspian went to hold faith was the place where Sterling confirmed that faith was keeping him exactly where Sterling needed him to be. Even his grief was monitored. Even his devotion was surveilled, measured, assessed for effectiveness. Not for what it was, but for whether it was still doing the job it was designed to do. "I am sorry, Mr. Shaw." Aldo's voice carried the weight of a man apologizing not for a single act, but for a sustained silence. For every Friday he polished glasses and said nothing. For every evening he watched and understood and kept his knowledge locked behind the same steady hands and careful eyes that made him good at his work and complicit in his failure to speak. "I should have spoken sooner." Caspian looked at him, looked at the weathered hands flat on the bar, the glass set aside, the cloth folded neatly beside it, looked at the face of a man who had carried this knowledge the way Caspian had carried his grief. Quietly, constantly, with the full understanding that setting it down would change everything, and the daily choice to hold it one more day. "You're speaking now. That's what matters." 4 words. Enough to release Aldo from years of silence. Not enough to erase them, but enough to say, "I hear you, and I am not going to punish you for the courage it took to finally open your mouth." The 2 men sat with that for a moment, the brass fixture humming faintly above them, the shadows holding still in the corners of the room, the empty restaurant carrying their silence the way it had carried so many others. Except, this one was different. This one was chosen. Friday evening arrived at Vesper the way Fridays always arrived. Slowly at first, then all at once. The golden light through the front windows filtered through old glass that had been in those frames for decades, pooling on the hardwood floor in wide warm bands. The cedar panels along the far wall held the warmth they'd absorbed through the day, releasing it slowly as the temperature outside dropped, making the room feel lived in even before the first guest arrived. From the kitchen came the scent of bread cooling on wire racks, yeasty sweetness drifting through the dining room in slow currents, mixing with the cedar and the leather and the faint trace of lemon polish that never quite left the air. Caspian sat at the corner table, but he was not sitting the way he used to sit. For years, his posture at this table had carried a specific quality: alert, watchful, tense with a hope he refused to name. He would face the door. His eyes would move to it every few minutes, scanning the entrance with the half-desperate vigilance of a man who knows the odds are impossible but cannot stop himself from checking. Every time the door opened, every couple arriving for dinner, every solo diner checking a reservation, every server stepping outside for air, his eyes would lift, his body would tense, and for one fraction of a second the hope would rise before settling back into the low, steady ache that had become its permanent resting state. Tonight, he was not watching the door that way. Tonight, he was watching for them. The difference was everything. He sat with his shoulders settled, his hands resting on the tablecloth, his body carrying the stillness of a man who is not scanning for the unlikely, but waiting for the certain. They were coming. He knew they were coming. Not because she had promised, not because obligation or guilt demanded it, because she had chosen. And he had learned, in these past weeks, that Lyra's choices carried a weight that no amount of hoping or Friday night vigils could match. When she walked through a door, it was because her feet had brought her there on purpose. She appeared in the doorway with Silas beside her, his small hand in hers. The boy's grey-green eyes scanned the room with the quiet intelligence that belonged entirely to neither parent and completely to both, measuring, assessing, taking in the space with the same careful attention his mother brought to buildings and his father brought to boardrooms. A 6-year-old reading a room the way his parents read structures, looking for what holds and what doesn't. This was her choice, her feet, her son's hand in hers. She had put on her coat, taken Silas by the hand, and walked to a restaurant, where a man she was only beginning to remember sat at a table that had waited for her. She did it because she wanted to, and that wanting, that agency, that deliberate decision to show up, was worth more than any recovered memory or any photograph or any object in a keepsake box could provide. Memory could be stolen. Choice could not. She sat down. Silas climbed into his chair, the one that had been empty all those years, the one that fit him as if it had always been waiting for exactly this body, this boy, this particular arrangement of small limbs and serious eyes. 3 chairs. 3 people. The geometry of the table complete. Not a man and a ghost and a hope. but 3 points of a constellation that had existed in potential all along and was only now, in this warm light, in this cedar-scented room, being drawn into visible form. Aldo appeared without being called. He set a glass of water in front of Lyra, a whiskey in front of Caspian, and a warm croissant on a small white plate in front of Silas, alongside a ceramic dish of softened butter no bigger than a child's palm. Nobody had ordered. Nobody needed to. Aldo knew. He had always known what this table required. And now that the table was full, now that the 3 chairs held 3 people and the geometry was complete, he knew this too. Water, whiskey, warm bread. The simplest things. The things you offer when offering is all you can do, and when offering is enough. They talked, carefully. 2 people navigating a conversation where every word carried the weight of all those missing years, and the fragile, uncertain promise of something that might, if handled gently, if neither of them gripped it too tightly or moved too fast, grow back. Caspian asked about her work. She told him about a building she was redesigning, a commercial structure in the arts district. 3 stories, solid framing, good bones. The bones are fine, she said, turning her water glass slowly on the cloth. It's the foundation that's wrong. Someone poured it without checking the soil composition, so the whole building is settling unevenly. The east wall has shifted 2 inches in 11 years. She didn't say the metaphor aloud. She didn't look at him when she said flawed foundation. She didn't need to. The words sat between them alongside the water and the whiskey and the bread, and they meant exactly what they meant and also everything else. Silas ate his croissant in small, deliberate bites, pulling it apart with his fingers before bringing each piece to his mouth, occasionally dabbing butter with a precision that seemed borrowed from someone much older. He listened to their conversation without participating, his eyes moving between his mother's face and Caspian's, following the rhythm, tracking the exchange, absorbing the pattern without needing to join it. He was content, settled, a boy sitting in a chair that fit him, eating bread in a room that smelled like cedar and warmth, flanked by 2 people whose voices, when layered together in conversation, produced a sound he recognized in a place deeper than thought. Friends, I need you to pay very close attention to what happens next. Because what you're about to hear, it's the moment that changes everything in this story. If you're still here with me, stay with me. Don't look away. What happens next at this table? You're going to remember it. Caspian reached for his silverware. It was not a conscious decision. Not the deliberate action of a man preparing to eat, not the purposeful arrangement of tools before a meal. It was the thing his hands did when they were near a table setting. His fingers found the knife first, lifting it slightly and repositioning it so that its edge ran perfectly parallel to the table's edge. Not approximately parallel, not close enough, but precisely aligned. The blade a fixed distance from the plate, the handle resting at exactly the angle his hand required. Then the fork moved a fraction of an inch to the left, settling into position where the tines pointed upward at the correct angle. Then the spoon brought into alignment with both. 3 instruments forming a geometry that satisfied something deep in his hands. Something that had nothing to do with dining etiquette and everything to do with the particular way Caspian Shaw's mind organized the physical world around him. The grip was specific. His thumb and first 2 fingers formed a precise triangle around the handle of each piece. Not a fist, not a casual pinch, but a 3-point hold that distributed pressure evenly across the metal. The pad of his index finger rested just below the neck of the spoon, pressing lightly against the curved transition where handle became bowl. It was the grip of a man who held pens and contracts, and the hands of people he cared about, with the same unconscious precision. The geometry of touch that lived so deep in his muscle memory that he could no more change it than he could change the color of his eyes. He set the spoon down. A brief pause at the end, a half-second where the spoon hovered above the cloth before making contact. Then, the sound, silver meeting porcelain, a clean, bright note that rang once and faded into the warm air of the restaurant. Silas picked up his spoon. He did not look at Caspian, did not glance sideways to study the man's hands, did not pause his chewing to observe and imitate, did not perform the careful mimicry of a child who has noticed an adult's behavior and decided to try it on. He was still eating his croissant, still pulling it apart in small deliberate pieces, still chewing with the quiet contentment of a boy whose body was fed and whose mind was floating somewhere in the warm current of his parents' conversation. His hand found the spoon without searching, without adjusting. Same hand, same angle, same three-finger grip, thumb and first two fingers forming an identical triangle around the handle, the same distribution of pressure, the same architecture of touch. The pad of his index finger rested just below the neck of the spoon, pressing against the curved transition in exactly the position Caspian's finger had occupied moments earlier. He adjusted the spoon's placement on the table, not dramatically, not with the fussy precision of an imitator, but with the quiet certainty of a body performing a motion it has always performed, a gesture so native to his hands that it required no thought, no observation, no instruction. Same pause at the end. The spoon suspended above the cloth for one beat. The same half-second, the same hovering stillness, before descending. Then the sound, silver meeting porcelain. The same clean, bright note. The same pressure. The same release. The same ring fading into the same warm air. Two identical sounds separated by less than a breath. Once from Caspian's side of the table. Once from Silas's, like a single heartbeat split across two bodies, father and son performing the same unconscious ritual, as if the gesture had traveled through blood instead of instruction, as if the particular way a man holds a spoon could be carried in the architecture of inheritance, the way eye color is carried, the way bone structure is carried, the way certain silences pass from one generation to the next without anyone choosing to pass them on. Lyra saw it. She had seen it before. She had watched Silas at their kitchen table, his fork angled left at precisely 30 degrees, his knife blade turned inward, his spoon perpendicular to the edge of his placemat. She had watched him perform that ritual every morning for years. And, 3 days ago, watching Caspian at this very table, arranging his silverware in the exact same pattern with the exact same precision, she had finally understood what she was seeing. She had seen it in her kitchen. She had seen it in this restaurant. But she had never seen it like this. She had never seen them do it together. She had never heard the twin sound. The same note, struck twice, from two different hands, separated by less than a breath. Watching your son perform a gesture at home is one thing. Watching him mirror his father in real time, in the same room, at the same table, producing the same sound at the same moment, that was something else entirely. That was inheritance made audible. That was blood announcing itself in silverware and timing, and the particular pause before a spoon touches a plate. The evidence she had gathered separately was now sitting in front of her, unified, undeniable, performing itself without performance. The truth sat in the space between them so clearly that no document could say it louder. No hospital file, no financial report, no signature on a yellowed form could make the case more plainly than two spoons touching two plates at the same angle, with the same pressure from hands built on the same blueprint. Lyra's throat tightened. Her fingers pressed against the tablecloth, the fabric bunching slightly beneath her grip. She looked at Caspian's hand resting beside his plate, then at Silas's hand resting beside his, and the mirror between them was so precise, so complete, so entirely without performance or pretense, that the air around the table seemed to change, not warmer, not colder, just different, charged with the presence of something true finally arriving in a room that had been holding space for it. Silas looked up from his plate. His grey-green eyes moved to Caspian first, studying the man's face with the steady, unhurried attention of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time, and has decided, without drama and without fear, that now is the moment to say it. Then his eyes moved to his mother. "He's my father, Mama." The kitchen sounds continued. Somewhere behind the swinging door, a pot shifted on a burner. Water ran briefly and stopped. The golden light through the front windows didn't change. The cedar panels on the walls held their warmth. The bread, on Silas's plate, sat half-eaten beside the small ceramic dish of softened butter. Nothing in the physical room moved. Everything in the emotional room shifted. I knew before I met him. He had shown her evidence before. The silverware ritual at home. The drawing he made 4 months before he ever saw Caspian's face. The locket he carried 6 blocks across the city to a restaurant where a man sat alone at a corner table. He had demonstrated his certainty through action, through objects, through the quiet determination of a boy who understood something the adults around him were still fighting to accept. But he had never said the word, until now. Father. He said it simply, without performance, without dramatic weight. A child shouldn't be asked to carry. Without the trembling voice, or the wide eyes, or the theatrical pause that stories assign to children when they speak difficult truths. He said it clearly, precisely, with the quiet confidence of a boy who had arrived at this conclusion long before anyone gave him permission to reach it. The evidence had been shown. Now he was naming it, not proving, claiming. The word itself, spoken aloud for the first time, released into the warm air of a restaurant where it had waited to be spoken for nearly a decade. Caspian's hands went still on the cloth, completely still, the involuntary stillness of a body that has received an impact too large for the nervous system to process and movement simultaneously. His grey-green eyes, the same ones looking back at him from a 6-year-old face, the same colour, the same quiet intensity, the same way of holding a gaze without flinching, burned with something he couldn't name and couldn't stop. It wasn't joy exactly, though joy was in it. It wasn't grief, though grief ran through it like a current through deep water. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere you didn't know you were travelling to. The sudden recognition that every step you've taken, every Friday you've sat at this table, every glass you've held and every door you've watched has been leading to this exact moment, this exact voice, this exact pair of eyes looking at you across a table and saying the thing you didn't dare say first. He reached across the table, slowly, the way you reach for something precious you're afraid will disappear if you move too fast. A flame that flickers in a draught, or the face of someone you thought you'd lost forever. His hand crossed the cloth, passing the bread plate and the butter dish and the silverware that had already said everything there was to say, and stopped in front of Silas. Silas gave him his hand. Small fingers wrapped in larger ones. The boy's hand disappeared inside the man's, the way a key fits inside a lock. Not consumed, not overwhelmed, but fitted. Held. Received by a grip that had been empty for years and didn't know, until this second, what it had been shaped to hold. Father and son, hands clasped across the table, connected for the first time by touch instead of silence, by skin and warmth, and the pressure of fingers instead of the circumstantial evidence of spoons and eye color, and the way certain people hold certain things. Caspian opened his mouth. No sound came. The man who had commanded boardrooms, who had negotiated contracts worth more than some countries' annual budgets, who had spoken to investors and boards with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being heard, could not produce a single word. His lips parted and parted again, and what came out was nothing, was silence, was the absence of language in a moment that language could not hold. He didn't need to speak. His grip said everything. The pressure of his fingers around his son's hand, steady and certain, trembling only at the very edges where control met feeling, said what no word could say as clearly. I am here. I have you. I am not letting go. Lyra watched them, her son's small hand inside this man's larger one, the two of them connected by a bridge of clasped fingers, and something cracked open inside her chest, not broke, not shattered. Those words belonged to destruction, to damage, to things falling apart. This was the opposite. Something cracked open the way a door cracks open. A door sealed from the inside, locked so long that the hinges had rusted and the frame had warped and the wood had swollen shut. 3 seconds. That's all she'd gotten before, standing in her doorway with the photograph trembling in her hands. 3 seconds of his voice, the weight of the locket, the knowing. 3 seconds of total recall that had flooded through her body and then retreated, leaving her gasping in the aftermath, holding fragments of a life she couldn't fully reach. Those 3 seconds, had been a crack in a sealed door. This, watching her son hold his father's hand, hearing the words spoken aloud, sitting in this room where cedar and espresso and warm light pressed against her from every direction. This was the door swinging open completely. The memory came. Not in fragments this time. Not in the 3-second flashes that had haunted her since the photograph. This memory rose through her whole and complete, filling every space it was given, moving not with force but with the patient certainty of something returning to where it belongs. A late night, years ago. This table. Candles burned low in small glass holders. The wax pooling around the wicks in translucent puddles that caught the light and held it. The restaurant was nearly empty. Just them, just this corner, just the warm circle of candlelight and the cedar walls, and the particular quality of silence that exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. His hand over hers on the cloth. Warm. Steady. The callus on his right palm pressing against her knuckles with the specific roughness of a man who used his hands, who gripped pens and railings, and the edges of desks and the shoulders of people he cared about with a pressure that left its mark on his own skin. Rosemary in a small glass vase at the center of the table. The scent sharp and green and alive, cutting through the heavier smells of wine and bread and candle wax. His voice, lower than usual, lower than the voice he used in meetings or on the phone or in conversation with anyone who wasn't her. The voice he kept for this table, for this hour, for the woman sitting across from him whose hand fit inside his, the way certain things fit together. Not because they were shaped identically, but because they were shaped in response to each other. I love you, Lyra. Her own voice, the one she had lost, the one that existed only in the gap between who she was now and who she had been before someone decided the gap should exist. Answering without hesitation, without the careful, measured pause she brought to everything else in her life, without weighing the words or testing them for load capacity before trusting them to hold. I know. I've known since the risotto. His laugh. Short, surprised, real. The kind of laugh that escapes before you can catch it, a sound forced out by genuine delight, by the specific joy of being known so thoroughly that the woman you love can name the exact meal where she decided to love you back. The risotto. She remembered the risotto now. Their first dinner at Vesper, back when it was just a restaurant and not a monument. Back when the corner table was simply a table and not a vigil. She remembered the way he'd ordered for both of them without asking, then immediately apologized, then laughed when she told him she'd been about to order the exact same thing. She remembered 2 glasses of wine and bread they hadn't touched because they couldn't stop talking, because every sentence opened a door to another sentence, and every door led to a room they both wanted to stay in. The rosemary sprig she pulled from the vase and tucked into her jacket pocket, because it smelled like that night, and she wanted to carry the night with her. The receipt from that first dinner, the napkin with his phone number written in blue ink, the 7s crossed in that particular way she teased him about. Who crosses their 7s? People who want you to call them. His smile when he said it, the one that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. Every object in the keepsake box, every relic she had carried for years, handling them like artifacts from someone else's life. The receipt she couldn't explain, the napkin she couldn't place, the dried rosemary she kept in a small envelope, without knowing why its scent made her chest ache. They were hers. They had always been hers, not artifacts, not relics, not remnants of a stranger's history she happened to carry without ownership. They were the physical evidence of a love she had lived inside, a love that had produced a child and a locket, and a man who sat at a corner table, waiting for her to walk back through the door. She looked at Caspian. She looked at him with both sets of eyes. The woman she was now, rebuilt from wreckage, strong in the broken places, precise and careful, and trained to read the structural truth of everything she touched. And the woman she was then, young and certain and fiercely in love with a man whose laugh escaped before he could catch it, and whose 7s were crossed, and whose hand on hers felt like the foundation she'd been looking for her entire life. I remember. Her voice cracked on the second word. Not from weakness. It cracked from the immense weight of reclaiming what was stolen. Years of a life she had lived without knowing she was living in its shadow. Years of carrying objects she couldn't explain, and feeling aches she couldn't source, and reaching for a spot on her throat where a locket should have hung. The 3-second flash at her doorway had given her fragments. Sensation without context. Feeling without framework. This gave her everything else. The full scene. The complete memory. The door swinging open after being sealed shut for nearly a decade. I remember you. 3 words, spoken across a table that had held an empty chair for years, and now held a father gripping his son's hand, and a mother who had just walked back into her own life through a door she didn't know existed until she heard a boy say "Father," and felt the hinges give. Caspian's hand tightened around Silas's. His other hand, the one that had been empty for so long, resting on glass rims and tablecloth edges and the arms of chairs and the cold surface of a desk 42 stories above a grey river, always resting, always holding nothing, moved across the table and found hers. Father, mother, son. 3 hands connected in the warm light of a room that smelled like cedar and bread, and the faint trace of rosemary that might have been memory and might have been real, and was, in this moment, both. A constellation drawn in clasped hands, held together by something no signature could erase and no lie could break. The wall was still there. Sterling was still there. The trap was still set. The signatures still real. The flash drive still sitting in a safety deposit box registered under a borrowed name. None of that had changed, but the 3 people sitting at this table had changed. And what they held between them, in the grip of clasped hands, in the sound of a boy's voice saying "Father," in 2 words cracked open by the weight of everything they carried, was stronger than architecture, stronger than paper, stronger than any structure built on stolen ground. If that moment hit you the way it hit me, leave a comment. 1 word, 2 words. Whatever you're feeling right now, I want to hear it, because I had to stop 3 times recording this part. This one stays with you. The restaurant settled into the deep quiet that comes after emotional storms pass through. The kitchen had gone silent. The last of the evening's bread had cooled on its rack. The golden light through the front windows had deepened to copper, the sun dropping below the roofline across the street and leaving behind the particular quality of light that exists only in the narrow window between evening and night. Warm enough to see by, dim enough to feel private. Silas had fallen asleep in the booth. His small body was curled against the leather, knees drawn up, one arm tucked beneath his head and the other resting across his chest. His fist was closed around the silver locket. The 1 lira had slipped into his jacket pocket before they left the apartment that evening. The one he'd been carrying against his heart all through dinner without mentioning it. The chain trailed across his wrist and pooled in the crease of the leather beside him, catching the low light in a thin line of silver that rose and fell with his breathing. He held the locket completely, unconsciously, with the absolute grip of a hand that doesn't know it's holding something, and therefore cannot be persuaded to let go. The deep, even breathing of a child who has said the hard thing and found peace on the other side of it. Lyra watched her son sleep for a long moment, her hands still resting on the table where Caspian's fingers had held it. Then she moved, not away from him, beside him. She stood from her chair, walked around the corner of the table, and sat down on Caspian's side. Not across from him, beside him, looking in the same direction, shoulder to shoulder. The way 2 people sit when they are no longer facing each other across a divide, but standing on the same side of something, looking outward together at whatever comes next. It was such a small motion, a woman changing chairs. But in the geometry of this table, a table that had held 2 chairs facing each other for years, one occupied and one empty, the distance between them filled with grief and hope and the kind of waiting that erodes a person. The shift was seismic. For the first time, they were not looking at each other across the cloth. They were looking at the same thing from the same place. She pulled the hospital file from her bag. Then the photograph, the one Aldo had kept all those years. The one that had triggered her first 3 seconds of memory. The proof that what they had was real. The manila envelope was creased at the corners from being carried, the paper softened by the warmth of being pressed against her side for days. She opened the file on the table between them, turning the pages until she reached the form near the back. The yellowed page, the signature line, the confident, unhurried handwriting. Sterling was at the hospital before you knew I was hurt. Her voice was steady. The crack from earlier had sealed itself. Not healed, but hardened. The way a fracture in stone becomes denser under pressure. He signed as my emergency contact, claimed I had no family. She let the word sit in the air. Family. The word Sterling had written on a hospital form in his careful handwriting. Claiming a relationship he had no right to claim, erasing the one that actually existed. He erased you from my records, Caspian, before the ink was dry on my admission form. She laid the photograph beside the file. The image of them laughing at this very table, his hand over hers, the locket catching light. 2 pieces of evidence now. The proof of what was. The proof of who took it. Caspian looked at the signature, looked at the handwriting he had seen on 1,000 documents, memos, contracts, quarterly summaries, the notes Sterling left on his desk in that same steady script. He had trusted that handwriting, had read it as the penmanship of a careful, thorough, reliable man. He was looking at it now, and it said exactly the same things it had always said. Careful, thorough, reliable. Except now those qualities pointed in a different direction. The same steadiness that had made Sterling a good partner had made him a meticulous thief. He laid his file beside hers. The financial report. The forensic investigator's findings printed on plain paper. Numbers and dates and corporate registrations, and the trail of money moving through shell companies invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. He opened it to the first page. It started before, 14 months before you were hurt. He was already stealing, already building something that couldn't survive me paying attention. He turned a page. The numbers told their story in the language of money, but the story beneath the numbers was simpler and more terrible than any ledger could convey. And when you made me pay attention, when you made me alive, he took you away. Not because of the accident, because of what I was when I was with you. He turned to the section he hadn't shown anyone. The development contracts. The commercial property acquisitions. He angled the pages toward her so she could read them. The addresses. The project descriptions. The company names. He used my name, my money, my signature to move into your industry. The corridors you work in. The projects you bid on. The buildings you redesign. Lyra's eyes moved across the pages. Her expression didn't change. The same controlled, analytical stillness she brought to every structural assessment. But her fingers pressed harder against the table's edge. He wasn't just watching me through this restaurant, Lyra. He was watching you through the market. You rebuilt your entire career on ground he was already standing on, with my name on every deed. He didn't just erase Lyra from Caspian's world. He inserted himself, invisibly, financially, structurally, into hers. He controlled the landscape she walked through without her ever knowing that the ground beneath her feet belonged to the man who had put her in a hospital bed and the man who had grieved her from a corner table. Sterling had built the crime around both of them, wrapped it around their lives like a wall they couldn't see because they were standing inside it. 3 pieces of evidence now, side by side on the table. The hospital file, the photograph, the financial report, her evidence and his. The signature that erased her past, the image that proved they were real, the money trail that exposed their future. Between them, invisible but present, Aldo's revelation from the night before, the manager, the phone calls, the sacred room turned watchtower. 3 investigations, 3 angles, 1 intersection. He didn't just lie to you. Lyra's voice was quiet but carried the density of something compressed. Years of unknowing. Years of questions she couldn't ask because she didn't know the questions existed. He stole me. He stole both of us. He stole 7 years. For the first time in all of this, the reservation book and the keepsake box and the photograph and the chair that wasn't empty anymore. They were not sitting across from each other. They were beside each other, looking at the same enemy, united not by memory alone, but by shared purpose, shared fury, and the quiet recognition that whatever came next, they would face it from the same side of the table. Across the city, 40 minutes from the restaurant, Sterling Graves stood inside a climate-controlled vault. The light was flat and white, designed to preserve documents and eliminate shadow, turning his silver hair the color of old coins and washing the warmth from his skin. The room held no cedar, no leather, no golden glow. It held metal shelving and reinforced walls and the steady hum of temperature control units maintaining the conditions required to keep paper and electronics unchanged by time, waiting to be used. He adjusted his cufflinks. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. His fingers moved against the gold with repetitive precision, not habit but compulsion. The tell of a man whose internal architecture was under stress. His fingers trembled against the metal. He pressed his sleeve down to cover it. The restaurant manager had called 20 minutes ago, brief, nervous, speaking in clipped tones. They're investigating, both of them, together. Together. Sterling had built his entire structure on the assumption that together was impossible, that the distance between Caspian and Lyra was permanent, maintained by amnesia on one side and grief on the other, reinforced by years of silence and the careful architecture of lies that kept them circling the same truth without ever meeting at its center. Together was the one condition his construction could not survive. Separately, they were manageable. A grieving man who signed without reading. A woman who couldn't remember what she'd lost. Together, they were 2 angles of vision converging on the same point. 2 sets of evidence laid side by side. 2 minds aimed at the same flaw in the same wall. He opened the safety deposit box, registered under a borrowed name. A name that would mean nothing to anyone searching his records or Caspian's. Inside, a manila folder and a flash drive. Both placed here 3 years ago, when Sterling first considered the possibility that his construction might be tested. He opened the folder. Financial records, shell company registrations, development contracts, property deeds, every one bearing Caspian Shore's name, every signature authentic, real signatures given by a real hand, applied to real documents during years of real grief. The folder was built like a controlled demolition. Pull one wire and everything comes down. But it doesn't come down on the man who built it. It comes down on everyone inside. He picked up the flash drive, turned it once between his fingers. Small, black, unremarkable. He held it for a moment, then set it back inside the box without opening it, without plugging it in, without revealing, even to himself, what lived on the drive that had been waiting in this box for 3 years. The folder's contents were known now. The financial trail, the shell companies, the captured signatures. Those cards were on the table, or would be soon. But the flash drive was something else. Whatever Sterling had stored on it, whatever information or evidence or leverage it contained, he had stored it for a reason. And he had left it untouched for 3 years, which meant the reason hadn't arrived yet. Or the reason was the kind you hold in reserve. The last card in a hand you play only when every other card has failed. He closed the box, walked through the vault, through the corridor, through the lobby, stepped into the parking lot, crossed to his car, sat behind the wheel. For 3 minutes, he stared through the windshield at a road that led back to the city, back to the life he had built on stolen happiness. He adjusted his cufflinks twice more, watching his own hands in the rearview mirror. Then he picked up his phone. At Vesper, Caspian's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, then at Lyra. He answered, set the phone face up on the cloth between them, and pressed the speaker button. Sterling's voice filled the quiet restaurant. Kaz, whatever you think you found, I need you to think carefully. Think about what I've built. The same words from the opening. The same measured cadence. The same warmth wrapped around a threat. But different now. Because now, sitting on the other side of these words, you know what Sterling built. You know about the hospital form. You know about the locket's orientation. You know about the 14 months of theft. You know about the shell companies and the captured signatures and the commercial properties laid beneath Lyra's feet like a trap dressed as a flaw. It has your name on it, all of it, every company, every contract, every signature. True, every word of it true. That's what made the threat precise. Sterling didn't need to lie anymore. The truth was his weapon. You push this, Cass, and the folder doesn't just end me. A pause. It ends us both. Caspian set the phone down. The screen dimmed. Sterling's name faded. Silas still slept, the locket in his fist. Lyra sat beside Caspian, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of graphite on her fingers. She had heard every word. For a moment, neither spoke. The threat sat on the table alongside the files, the evidence of a crime built to destroy the people who exposed it. Lyra looked at the table, at the cloth, the light, the files, the photograph, the phone with its darkened screen, at the place where she had fallen in love and been erased and come back and remembered. He built his trap with your trust. That means the trap has the same flaw he does. She turned to face him fully, shoulder leaving shoulder, eyes finding eyes. It's built on something stolen, and stolen things don't hold. She meant the contracts, the shell companies. Every square foot of commercial property Sterling had wrapped in Caspian's name. Stolen money, stolen signatures, stolen trust. Every piece of the trap was built from materials that didn't belong to the builder, and materials that don't belong to the builder can be reclaimed by their rightful owner. That was the flaw. Caspian looked at her, at the woman who had lost years and rebuilt a life without knowing the ground was poisoned. The woman whose mind found fractures in foundations with patience, precision, and the absolute refusal to pretend a flaw isn't there. Then we find the flaw. Not a question, a decision, made together. Across the city, Sterling Graves adjusted his cufflinks one final time and stared at the road ahead, calculating the distance between power and collapse, and wondering, for the first time in years, whether that distance was as far as he had always believed. Stolen things don't hold. Remember that line, friends, because that's the key to everything coming next. If you believe Lyra's right, if you believe they're going to find the flaw, drop those 4 words in the comments. Stolen things don't hold. The fight for the truth has begun. Lyra and Caspian are united, side by side, same table, looking at the same enemy. They have the hospital file, the photograph, the financial trail, and Aldo's testimony. 4 pieces of evidence pointing at one man. But Sterling has the folder, and every signature inside it is real. Every contract is authentic. Every piece of evidence points at the wrong man. Not the man who committed the crime, but the man whose hand was used to commit it. And then there's the flash drive, still sitting in that safety deposit box, untouched for 3 years. We know what's in the folder. We don't know what's on that drive. Whatever Sterling stored on it, he stored it for a reason. And whatever that reason is, it's been waiting in the dark for 3 years. It's not waiting anymore. In part 4, they go to war, and not everyone walks away from it. That is part 3, friends. And I need you to hear me. Part 4 is where the gloves come off. If you want to be here when it drops, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you're the first to know. If this story moved you tonight, and I know it did because some of these scenes nearly broke me telling them, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a story that grabs them by the heart and doesn't let go. And one more thing. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, or if you're sending a friend to catch up, the links to both parts are right there in the pinned comment below this video. Check the pinned comment. Everything you need is waiting for you. From the hearth to wherever you are tonight, thank you for being here. I'll see you in part 4.